Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm so glad to connect on here.
Yeah, listen, I can't wait to hear your story. But as we were just chatting about all things neuroscience and law of attraction, I was like, ooh, me and her, we're not going to have a shortage of things to talk about.
No, I think we could be here for a while.
Oh my goodness. I should have prepared you a little for this, one of the lightning round questions that I have. And I'm going to throw it out to you now. And then I'm going to ask you some other questions. And it's this new question I'm asking people about I was calling it God shot stories, but I think maybe a better rephrasing of that would be like spiritual experience or evidence of God, something along those lines. And I can share a story to get your mind thinking about it. But I like to start off with this little lightning round first because it kind of front loads the episode with some resources. So if you're up for it,
Yeah,
I'll,
absolutely.
I don't know why it's a lightning round. It's actually a very slow thing. So do you have a favorite book that helped you early in recovery?
Ooh, I mean,
Like when you
there's been,
first got sober?
yeah, I was going to say there's been so many over the
I
years,
know.
but when I first got sober, so the first book that was introduced to me was the big book in treatment. But after that,
Alcoholics Anonymous.
yes. But after that, I went into my first yoga teacher training immediately after I got out of treatment.
Well, you
And
did.
it was very much for my own personal practice at that time. But there was such a strong sense of familiarity as I was learning about the Yoga Sutras and the 8 limbs of yoga, specifically with the 12 steps. And so I became obsessed with learning about the overlap. So there was like Keatsky Hawk's book, Yoga of 12-Step Recovery, which helped me connect the dots of what I had kind of started to piece together in my mind. And then The Wisdom of Yoga by Stephen Cope. And the reason that I loved that book, I'm actually rereading that book right now as part of a training. But the reason that I loved that book so much is that, well, for one, when you start to recognize these practices that date back thousands of years that are talking about the same type of human conditions, like, and in different language, like speaking a lot about it in terms of craving and attachment, and how those manifest in this book in different ways, like eating disorders or dysfunctional relationships, various things. I felt so much more compassion towards myself and so much more hope in that there's a pathway out of this, and it's well proven, for many, many years. And so I just felt that really also validated everything in the recovery program that I had been given, because the overlap is just things that are so simple and easily overlooked, like the power of community and this idea of spiritual surrender, of being of service. I mean, I could go on and on about all the overlaps, but yeah, I would say that was a very influential book early on. And gosh, I could list off so many books from then on.
I'm obsessed with books. And when you go to the odatchat.com website, there's right up front is like the Audible. It's
Oh
like your
yeah.
first, it's like, how the drug dealers are like, oh, first one is free. That's how Audible is. But at least
Yeah.
it feels like a healthy addiction, like all this knowledge. Man, as you were talking, I'm glad I'm recording this because I was writing everything you were saying. I was like, oh my gosh, she's like saying all these amazing things. One of the ideas that we were talking about, these like ancient wisdom traditions, the thought that kept coming back to me is times change, but people don't,
Yes,
right? We
exactly.
all have these instincts that are well and good, but it's when they go out of balance that's when it becomes problematic, right?
Yeah. And so much of what we're talking about with the conversation with addiction, I mean, it taps into very primal aspects of being human that date back way, way before like our modern lives.
Yes, our modern lives. We like to think that we're modern. I suppose we're like bombarded with all this technology, right? Have you ever seen oh gosh, it was in Netflix. It was about social media.
Oh, the
Oh,
social dilemma.
thank you. Yeah. I interviewed Dr. Anna Lemke, who was in that, but that blew my mind. They talked about how there's like hundreds and maybe thousands, I don't know, of engineers, on the other side of this little piece of glass. And it's all designed to keep and hold your attention. And I was like, well, mission accomplished, because that little piece of glass is always close by. It's just
Yeah.
amazing.
She is incredible. And it's like, well, for one, how sad that that's what we're employing, like the best psychiatrists and like the best in these fields to do. But I think it helps people remember too, like we need to have really strict boundaries around these things, because you can't, for every one of us, there's how many hundreds of the top neuroscientists and psychiatrists trying to hack our brain. Like you said, I mean,
Yeah,
it's
mission
crazy.
accomplished. If you told me 10 years ago that I would willingly carry a little thing around all the time, I would be like, what are you smoking? Like, that's never going to happen. And here we are.
Yeah, right.
It's hard. Yeah, it's definitely tricky to manage. What else did you say? You mentioned compassion and hope. And man, don't you feel like that's a leading question, but those are probably the two things that help me to not just stop drinking, but to heal. And it sounds like what you're saying is, this process of combining the overlap of yoga and 12 step has that hope and compassion really helped you to heal. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's hearing other people's stories was huge in that sense. And also, interestingly, learning about the neuroscience piece and how we're impacted by drugs and alcohol and how, addictions are formed was a great teacher of self-compassion, because
Mm,
you realize like, well, of course, of
yeah.
course, when we put ourselves under such huge amounts of stress that we do now, and we don't leave room for proper rest and self-care, and on top of that, we're talking about chemicals that are extremely addictive. I think all of
Right.
those things really helped with compassion.
Yeah. I like the idea too that it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility. Right.
Yes, exactly. Because you could hide behind that statement too, like, oh, it's not my
Yeah,
fault.
yeah. It's not my fault. Yeah. Just the first half. Oh, it's my responsibility though. My goodness. Okay, that was just the first question.
Oh
I
gosh.
told
Yeah,
you
we
this
could
was
definitely
slow.
go on and on.
I know this might be a little longer episode. That's okay. Do you have a go-to mantra or quote that you live by, or that you really focus on a lot or keep coming back to?
Well, the name of your podcast, One Day at a Time, would be an easy
Thank
one.
you. Thank you.
But since you've taken that one, no, but really that idea with being present. But
Yeah.
for me, kind of words to live by that I share with people a lot also is the idea that discipline is the path to freedom. And I think that and I know for me, there was so much resistance around that word discipline. And I think we have taken it
Yeah.
and used it in the wrong contexts and applied it to the wrong situations. But when it comes to the level of discipline, like showing up for my daily practice and, committing to all the little things that I know are what gonna keep me sober and keep me living free from addiction. Because when I think about when I did have this like, oh, I'll do what I want, like free spirit attitude, it was the opposite of freedom. I was like a slave to all of my cravings and addictions. And so I just love that discipline is the path to freedom.
No, that's beautiful. I don't know if you saw the shirt I'm wearing. It says, "What would Goggins do?" Do
Oh
you
yeah,
know?
he's
Do you
great.
know David Goggins? Yeah, and they talk about discipline though, and I was surprised to hear him say that discipline is actually the purest form of self-love. I was like,
Yes.
"Whoa, I love that." And you actually mentioned the daily practice, and that's actually the next question. Do you have what is your daily, or do you have a daily practice or weekly practice that helps you to stay sober?
I do. Yeah. So for me, meditation is incredibly important, and having a yoga practice. And I always share with people like that doesn't necessarily mean doing a full hour of yoga every single day, even, but really taking time to get into my body and have that check in is incredibly important. Spending time in nature. I know we've talked about before, like, I think it really is so much about the simple things. And I think there's a confusion about what self-care needs to look like with the very like consumer focused world of wellness. And to me, it's just about the simple things, journaling, being in nature, having meaningful real life interactions. I think I realized how important that was over the last couple of years. It became so apparent how much more anxiety inducing digital interactions can be for how amazing they are. All of the lost in translation and all of the inability to like read people, like be with people in person. So I find that being with my friends or family, like in person and having real conversations is a form of self-care that's become really important to me lately too.
Absolutely. I had an experience, gosh, when you were talking about that, the real life in person. During the pandemic, I grew so accustomed to being isolated. And I was very comfortable with Zoom and all that stuff. And then I held a women's retreat and I was in a house with 12 other women. So I went from like my husband and kids in a big house to 12 women. I totally underestimated
Oh yeah.
the impact that being around other people would have on me. I just think that's so interesting. But it's there again. It's like balance, right? Like a little. It could probably would have been a better idea to kind of ease into something like that.
Yeah, it's a huge retreats are such a huge kind of like energy exchange. I
Yeah,
mean, that was the best teacher of boundaries for me is like being in retreat situations and being okay with taking my time to like recharge. Cause I realized in
yeah,
sobriety, I'm somewhat of an introvert too, and
yeah.
when I was drinking, I could kind of numb out from those needs, but on retreats, you really realize you need to take care of yourself and recharge or it can just, yeah, it can be, I mean, they're an incredibly nourishing experience, but also if you don't have those boundaries in place, it can be really exhausting.
That's great that you gave yourself permission to just. And we did that too. I found myself like, I'm just gonna go over here for a little while, be alone. Um,
That's so good you did that though, because I feel like those type of experiences are so important right now.
yeah, they really are. The retreats.
Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of retreats have you been on?
So I actually spent before the pandemic, I was teaching and hosting retreats and traveling around full time doing that. So that was a
What?
huge part of my recovery journey. Yeah. Soon
Wow.
after I got sober, when I was living in Chicago, I was working at a digital advertising agency and
Oh my goodness.
I couldn't be in that environment. There was so much alcohol present. It was so wrapped up in my whole drinking
Yeah.
kind of personality, like this whole identity I just couldn't relate to anymore. And so I went to Southeast Asia and I ended up doing this backpacking trip that was meant to be 3 months that ended in this never ending. I'm still here 8 years later, almost 9 years
Years
since when I
later.
left.
Oh
But
my God.
I
Your
went to
parents must miss you.
yeah. Well, I've dragged them out here.
Oh, that's
But
awesome.
yeah, I moved into a retreat center. I spent most of my first year sober. It was like first and second year living in a yoga and meditation retreat center in
Which one?
Cambodia. It's called Hari
Oh,
Haralaya.
Cambodia. I thought you were going to
Yeah.
say like Kripalu or something.
No, yeah. I
Cambodia.
mean, that would be an amazing place to be too. There's been so many times that have come up there and I'm like, I wish wasn't a flight across the world to get there, but
I know, right? Yeah. Yeah, there's some amazing. I think that's actually a really important part of self-care. And so I'm so glad that you brought that up because it made me think, oh, self-care practice isn't just a daily morning thing. It can be, and sometimes I think what weekly, like I attend a certain number of meetings per week or go
yes.
to exercise a certain number of days per week. I forgot the whole maybe once a year, every 6 months, go on retreat. Those are
Yeah.
amazing.
And the really great thing about that, because I always tell people like retreats are not like a one off thing where you get stressed all year and then it's like you knock it out with a retreat and then go back to this crazy life. But I think it gives people the opportunity to learn and integrate daily practices. So you
Yeah.
go and you have this immersive experience, and then that kind of kickstarts the daily meditation practice or the daily journaling. But I know a lot of people would like to think like, oh, I'll just squeeze my self-care into this week in Bali
All
or
right. All right. Yeah. We're going to do a 3 week trip to Italy and Paris. And I was afraid to live. I had this counselor. I was like, I am nervous about being away. She goes, oh, no, 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 no. It's going to be a great reset for you. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. A
Mm.
reset. It'll just take me out of my little bubble for a little while. And she's like, this will be
Yeah.
so good for you. I'm like, I'm scared to go. Anyway.
Oh, that sounds like an amazing trip.
Yeah, that'll be good. Well, listen, you're 8 years into your trip.
Yeah.
So amazing. Okay. What's one thing you wish you knew when you first got sober?
Hmm.
That's a hard one.
Yeah. I wish that I knew that the critical voice in my head was not the bearer of truth. And like
That's
that I
such a
could,
beautiful way to put it. The critical
well,
voice is not the bearer of truth.
yeah, and just that I could disidentify because I allowed this inner critic in my head to dictate so much of how I felt about myself and project these judgments about me from other people, assuming they would react in a certain way to my sobriety or my struggle or that I
Mm,
needed. And that is so limiting. If we give that critical voice too much airtime, it can really like transform your life,
it
not in the
really
best
does.
way.
Were you afraid to tell people when you first got sober?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so. Like to an extreme. So I actually went to outpatient rehab for the first time and only my parents knew, not even my best friends. I took like a hiatus from school. And at the time, I didn't make that decision for myself. It was very forced upon me. I shouldn't say forced, but I was doing it for my parents.
Highly encouraged.
Highly encouraged.
Like,
Yeah.
we're not going to pay for your school anymore unless you go do this rehab thing.
Yeah. But
Was there an
even,
event that preceded that? That
yeah, I had a pretty significant bottom. So I was on a fast. I mean, it went from being like, I'm on top of the world, like in school, having the best time, going to all these like sorority parties and all the things. And then all of a sudden, it was like a tipping point happened where I was blacking out regularly. At that time is when I started to get into drugs like cocaine so that I could stay out drinking more. And I was taking a lot of Adderall so that I could continue to function at school. And I went from feeling like this is the best thing ever. And I'm like outgoing and having fun to just doing, blacking out, being like not recognizing the person that I was becoming, really harming my relationships. And it got so bad that I just woke up one morning and I could not face the day. I just was like, I couldn't leave my room. I was, living in a house with other people. And I called my parents, was like, I need to get out of here like right now. Please help me get out of here. And I I was in Colorado then, and I flew back to Chicago to go. And, next thing you know, I'm in treatment because they had seen me on this downward spiral too. They had plenty of experience with it at that time. But I did not realize that I didn't know what the 12 steps were. I didn't know what outpatient treatment. I didn't know that meant you need to get sober. I mean, I'd be okay with like moderation school,
you're going to treat it, right? So
Yeah,
that
just
we can continue.
right.
Yeah.
Like I got to go
Treat it,
back to
not
school
cure
and
it.
party.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't tell anyone that I was kind of like, I'm going to go home and take a little break because everybody had seen me kind of going on this fast downward spiral and I'd hurt some people. And it was just a lot of behavior that was out of character.
Did your friends express concern about your drinking, or you said you hurt some people, your friends mad at you for things that you did, or?
Yeah, that was the biggest thing. I mean, I have really always valued my close friendships, and I'm still friends with the friends that, during that time, like still some of my closest friends. And I'll actually never forget getting on the phone with one of my friends that morning and just having her say like, basically, I don't recognize you anymore. Like you've done such a 180. And it was so hurtful and it was so true. I knew it. Like there was no denying it. And that was so like that to me was enough motivation to do something about it. And unfortunately, I didn't get that to really do something about it would mean to get sober. So I went through outpatient treatment with this idea in my mind that like I will go back and get this under control, which, you know, from being in the recovery rooms, you're in two different realities. Like there's a massive inner conflict going on because that's not at all what the 12 steps say.
Get it
And
under
I was,
control, girl.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, I
No.
didn't tell anyone because I didn't, you know, I didn't want to be open about it at that point because then there's more accountability. There's acknowledging there's a problem.
Oh, yeah.
But even when I did go back and I was ready to fully surrender and I was ready to get sober, like that was in April of 2013. I only told the people I absolutely had to. So I told one of my best friends who I was living with at the time, and I told my direct supervisor at my advertising agency because leaving at 5 o'clock to get to a nights and weekends outpatient treatment was unheard of, like in that setting. I mean, I was staying till late at night every night, so I had to tell her. But I had so much shame around it. And I did like, and it was a different time in like, this was 9 years ago. So now
Mhm.
I'm blown away by the sober movement happening. And like, if there was this online space where I could see all these conversations happening and easily find people like that, I love the idea of having expanders like Lacey Phillips, who I mentioned to you, came up with that term, which is basically somebody who you can identify with, who's demonstrating that it's possible. And I really
Expand.
struggled to find someone that I related to at that time. And so I was scared and yeah, it wasn't until years later that I started to become really open about it.
That is amazing. I want to go back to something that you said. Um, something you said made me think, because when you were talking about being unrecognizable from the person that man, I remember those days where I'll tell you this one story. So I had a girlfriend, this is in the drinking days, right? So my girlfriend and I were getting ready to go out, and she was curling her hair. This is back in the 90s. So I'm going to curl like my bangs. She was curling her bangs because that's what we did in the 90s. And she dropped her curling iron on her eye and burnt her cornea. So, okay, I didn't know that she burnt her cornea, but she dropped her. And we were getting ready to go out. And do you know what I did as her friend? I was like, you need to call your dad and have him come get you because my shit's got to go out. Because there was this boy, there was a man. I was manhunting that night. I was all psyched to go. You know,
Oh
and
my
then,
gosh.
and I
Yeah.
was like, I knew I was an asshole in that moment and I could not stop myself. I
Yes.
had to go out. I
Oh my gosh,
had
I can
to.
totally relate to that. It's like the level of
Such a dick.
selfishness, you know?
Yes.
Well, they say addiction is like a disease of the ego. It's like our world. And even when we're so self-harming, it's like it's like have to like get that, you know, get that
Yeah.
alcohol or whatever it is. But yeah, oh,
Yeah.
those stories. I mean, it's good that we can look back now and be like, well, I'm sober now. I've done something about it because yeah,
Yeah,
I
well, I like that part in the 12-step literature that talks about we not regret the past or wish to shut the door on it. And listen, I have lots of stories to share to help people
yeah,
relate because I've seen people recover, and man, some people are unrecognizable after they get sober. They come in
yeah.
all that shame, they come in all broken down and like their shoulders are drooped, their head is down, they're staring at their feet, they can barely talk and introduce themselves. And then fast forward a year later, it's like they're standing at the podium and sharing, and they're in service and they look healthy and fresh. I'm like, whoa, man, people do not realize that sobriety is like the fountain of youth. you know?
Yes. You know, it's so funny too. Like I've had people who have met me on my retreats or met me when I'm teaching yoga. And when they hear bits about my story, they almost don't believe. They're like, what? Like, and I didn't speak openly about the fact that I was using drugs like cocaine and ecstasy, and I was abusing Adderall too. I had a lot of shame around that for a long time, especially, you know, this idea of like being a yoga teacher, and which is silly because a lot of people are driven to healing in like healing professions in various capacities because of their own struggle. But I realized I have to speak more openly about this because there's like, I'm not trying to project an image of myself that is someone who never used to like party and have this whole side that got me into rehab, because it made me feel like there's two different identities. There's the one that my friends from back home and my family know and have kind of seen play out. And then I'm not trying to, but it's funny how, yeah, we can underestimate, I think, sometimes how much we can change.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I think telling our stories is good to show people that like, yeah,
I just have to tell you
I
this
wasn't
one
just,
more. I just have to tell you this
yeah.
one story. When you talked about like seeing friends from your past who knew you when you were drinking, I I don't even remember I think I was like 25 years sober, and I go to this new gym and I'm working out with a trainer. And there was a man in the gym. And listen, when I'm at the gym, I'm looking at the floor, I'm looking at my trainer, I'm looking at myself in the mirror. I'm not
Yeah.
trying to, you know what I'm saying? I'm not there for anything other. I'm not there to make friends. Let's just put it that way. And anyway, this
Yeah.
man kept smiling at me. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, oh my God, that's Gary. It was this guy I had dated when I was drinking and using, and I hadn't seen
Oh my
him
gosh.
25 years, right? And I was like, oh my. So I started telling myself this story. I was like, oh my God, that's why he kept smiling at me. And then I started making up all these stories in my head, like, oh, he must think I'm such a bitch. Like I was pretending like I didn't know
Oh
him.
yeah.
And then I was like, oh, he must have, I was like,
That's
okay,
that critical voice.
it's the critical voice. And I was like, okay, this is what we're going to do. Next time we go to the gym, I'm going to be like, oh, hey, Gary, I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize you. It's been a long time. I didn't mean to be rude. I was doing this whole thing in my head. So I go to the gym and I see him and he's all smiling at me. And I'm all, hey, Gary. And he looks at me and he like stops. He does not know who I am. I'm
Oh my gosh. I love
unrecognizable. I'm unrecognizable from the woman that he knew. And he goes, I go, Arlena? And he goes, Messersmith? And I was like, oh dear God, because I've been married for 25 years, right? So I'm like, Alan? But and then I all of a sudden I saw myself through his eyes. I go, oh my God, he
Mm.
still thinks I'm that girl. It was just like a weird out of body experience where I was like, I'm unrecognizable. I'm not even that girl anymore. And he didn't recognize me.
Wow.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
so
You had a
funny.
lot to catch up
So
on then,
embarrassing.
huh?
Oh girl, no. I was like, I gotta go.
Yeah.
I
It's
was
funny
like, no,
too, like
thank
what
you.
our mind does, like how you could just have this whole story going on that you're having this awkward interaction and he thinks you're ignoring him. And meanwhile, like no, all of that was created in your mind.
It was all a fantasy in my head. It wasn't even based in reality. My mind just ran away with me. And there's this idea, the only thing that's stopping you from getting you want is the bullshit story that you're telling yourself. And it,
Exactly.
and it speaks to that,
Exactly.
right? Doesn't it speak to that idea that when we don't know the answer to something, our minds will create a story. Our mind's job is to think, right? And so I just
Yeah.
created this crazy ass story that wasn't even rooted in reality. It was so funny.
It reminds me, I think it's Byron Katie's The Work, where there's those
Oh my
questions like,
God.
is it true? Can I know, and geez, that in itself, it's like, why don't we ever
Man,
stop to ask that?
yeah. No, I'm so glad you brought her up. She is like one of my favorite teachers. So if you've never heard of Byron Katie, for those that are listening, just go to, is it just byronkatie.com? Or if you just do an internet search for the Byron Katie, the work, there's worksheets. She actually has a free app. Have you ever tried the app?
I haven't, no.
Oh my God, it's so good. It's called The Work. It's super good. And it sort of helps break down that negative subconscious limiting belief. and helps you see, it breaks through denial and it helps you to see yourself clearly. So
And that,
good.
yeah, I really think that whole process of deconstructing our thoughts and really getting curious about where they come from is such an important part of the process for getting sober and staying sober.
Amen to that. So let me take you back to your story. So you went to school in Colorado, you had the tipping point, and you're blacking out regularly, the drugs, the whole thing. You went to treatment, outpatient treatment. How long did you do outpatient treatment for?
So I was at Hazleton in Chicago for 6 weeks.
Okay.
And yeah, the first time I left school and I didn't really say where I was going, but I think there was this kind of unspoken understanding. It's pretty obvious things had gotten pretty bad for me among
Getting
my
help.
close friends. Yeah. It was kind of just, oh, I'm going to go home and kind of take a breather type of thing.
Yeah,
But yeah, that was 6 weeks.
6 weeks. And during your time at Hazelden, did they expose you to 12 steps, or did they have a process to help you sort of examine why you were behaving that way?
Yeah, so that was based on the 12-step program. So we went to meetings and I was also part of a group therapy, which was so beneficial. And it was really interesting. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday about oftentimes we see the very last point before someone got sober and we assign all of the credit to whatever that was, when actually
Mm,
there's all these things that happen along the way. And it made me think about that experience. I had no exposure to 12-step recovery before that. And that planted the seeds. And it really changed my perception about spirituality. It really planted a lot of important seeds. And so that was a big, even though it took 3 more years for me to get sober and really like surrender fully, I mean, that was a huge part of the recovery process for me. And so, yeah, it was based on the 12 steps and, having that group therapy support. That was what it was kind of
it's
based on.
interesting that yeah. So the idea, what a brilliant observation, though. We see the last point before recovery, and then we think that that's the thing,
Yeah, that
and
was
it's
Duncan
not.
Bhaskaran-Brown who said that to me yesterday, but it really just made me think like, and I thought it was so important because for family members or loved ones of people in addiction, it is so discouraging when you are
Yeah,
trying to be that supportive person. You're trying to do all the right things and nothing is changing. And so
right.
just to have that reminder that you probably are doing a lot of like planting a lot of important seeds, doing the,
Yeah.
helping that person chip away at whatever it is that's getting in their way, depending on the kind of support you're offering. But sometimes it really just
Right.
takes time.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you talked about needing 3 more years, and I was just having a conversation with somebody today where it took her, she had like this bottom, and then it took her 2 years to get sober. And I was like, holy crap, it's same. I had like the bad night, and then it was like the really bad night. And then 2 more years of starting to ask the questions. And I don't know what that is. It takes the ideas sort of have to like marinate a little bit, and we have to take these ideas and apply them to situations that are happening in our life, like, and it does take some time to be able to, like you said, fully surrender, like spiritually fully surrender. Did you have a moment of clarity or a spiritual experience that you were like, I need to surrender fully?
Yeah, I would say it was like there was a few key moments because what happened was after I was partying a lot when I was in school. I mentioned I was using cocaine and I was still very high functioning and I brought that into my career after I graduated. But the thing what happened with me was that while everybody else was kind of able to transition from partying really hard like that, like I still, when I would go out drinking, I would just start to crave cocaine or want to take Adderall at night because I wanted to keep going. And so there was such a strong trigger in my mind as soon as I tasted alcohol. And I couldn't seem to stop that. And so I started, because had so much shame around continuing to, want to use those drugs on like a Wednesday night when I'm at a work function, I would start to do it on my own, which again felt so far removed from not only what I was projecting to the outside, but who I wanted to be. So I had someone who was on delivery. And so what started to happen was I would black out, and I would come out of my blackout on a work night and realize that I was doing cocaine alone in my room. And I was like, okay, when did I split apart from this work function? When did I get this? Who might have seen me? It was just this whole really scary, like, you come out in like shock kind of thing. And so I started to really freak myself out at that point. And that was at like the end. And I started to actively like ask for help at that time. Like I remember dragging my best friend literally out of her bed at like 4 a.m, being like, and just kind of like spilling my guts. And I took a cab over to my brother's house who lived in a different part of Chicago. And I was like, wake up. And I just had to like get it out and tell someone. Like I was like, I need to tell you like this crazy stuff that keeps happening to me, because I know that like I was just promoted at work. And I'm like, it's crazy because I was not, you wouldn't have known, and
Yeah.
people didn't know, but it was killing me on the inside. So I think there was like a realization in those moments that I was like, there was like the final one, the final time that happened, I was just like, yeah, there was a deep inner knowing that's like, you are better than this. Like, this is not who you are. And it was that disconnection. Nikki Myers, who I know you've had on the podcast, speaks about this like fissure in our being, like this painful disconnection. And that's what was, to me, that was like the spiritual moment of like, this isn't who you are, And, you can numb out from this as much as you want, but like, I'm never going to stop telling you that. Like, and so, yeah, that was it. I ended up just, and fortunately, like I said, I had the tools. I knew what was going to help me. I had been in the rooms of AA. I'd heard so many incredible stories of transformation of people who at the time seemed way further down the line in their addiction. And so I really believed that I had the support as soon as I was willing to accept the help. And so I was fully ready. And I was like, I'm going back to Hazleton. I'm going to go to meetings. I started committing to a daily yoga practice at that time too. And yeah, so that was the moment, I would say, or moments.
That's amazing. And that was 9 years ago.
Yeah, so I just celebrated 9 years sober. Our sober dates, I've heard you share on yours. Yours is the 23rd of April, right?
It is.
So mine's April 27th of
Oh my God.
2013. So yeah, we're close enough.
Yay.
Different in years, of course, but yeah, it's
Well,
9 years.
9 years, that's a big deal. Oh my gosh. That's a really big deal. I remember being asked to do a secretary and for a really big meeting. And she was like, "Oh, there's a sobriety requirement. How many years?" And I was like, 8. Like, I was like trying to be humble. She's like, "Oh yeah, that's okay." And I mean, she had like 30 years sober. So to her, I was like nothing. I was like, "Bitch, I'm a big deal."
And how many years is it now?
28.
Oh, that's so amazing. I was just thinking like, I love having conversations with people who have like decades of sobriety, especially who have been working like a 12-step program, because there's just a level of humility and genuine commitment to service that's like, and you really do have that. And I just think
Thank
like,
you. That's so sweet.
yeah, it's amazing to be able to, and it makes me excited because do you find that you continue like to kind of peel back the layers and
Oh
learn
my
more about
goodness.
yourself through the process?
Yes, because you know what's funny about long-term sobriety is you end up coming full circle. Because so I know you like neuroscience stuff, right? So if you
Yeah.
think about the default mode network, right? And so your brain, it's your brain's operating system that's set by the time you're about 6 or 8 years old. And it's your default, which means I can work towards moving away from my default, which is, I'll give you an example. So, like being angry, I have learned through a lot of work in sobriety that anger for me is a sign that I'm really sad. But when
Mm.
I grew up, we didn't do sad. That was not acceptable. So, but angry was. And so there's the dynamic, right? So I'm trucking along in my life and I think I'm getting better. You know?
Yeah.
and then and then I bump up against new situations that throw me back to survival mode. And when I'm sad or afraid, I get angry. So being a parent is a very good example of that. And I have found myself behaving badly.
Mm.
Oh God. Like I had a younger son that went to rehab a year ago. And I was sad and scared, but what came out was angry.
Mm.
And it's embarrassing at this bit. And that's why maybe that when you said humility, it's like, I don't know if it's a shameful thing or it's like, God damn it, am I not better yet? It's like, what? Why did I behave badly? You know, of course, I know how to make amends. So that happens quickly, which is good. And I think in parenting, you know, my husband and I, he's been sober a long time too. So even longer than me. And so we, over the years have, when we make a mistake as a parent, you apologize and you make amends, apologize and acknowledge the behavior and then change it.
Mhm.
Right. So, but yeah, it's just kind of, it's humbling to just the continued wrestling with your humanity. That's why it's one day at a time, because it doesn't matter how many years you have, still human. So
Yeah. And we're given these little tests along the way, I think. And that's, I mean, what better?
exercises.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see
Yeah.
how well you've recovered. No,
Did
that's
you
why it's like
did
a
you grow up
forever.
did you
Sorry,
grow
good.
up with any kind of religion?
So I mean, yes and no. Like it was never a big part of my upbringing at all, but we went to church on Christmas and
Yeah,
Easter,
yeah.
but it was definitely, and that was that was the interesting thing that I had to work through with AA too, because
Yeah.
it wasn't, I know some people have a real aversion to the word God, and it wasn't that for me, but it was just like, okay, you're saying that this is a foundational piece of my recovery, but this feels like really unstable ground because I don't have a relationship with God. And I
Yeah.
didn't understand yet at that point that there was more, that God was not limited to what I had learned in church.
Yeah.
And that
And the
was a huge
reason I
shift.
asked you about that, there's a couple of things I want to know what the evolution of that was for you. But when you said that there were these tests, like I grew up religious where God would test you, like you could
Oh,
fail.
wow.
You know what I mean? Yeah. And I didn't like school. So
Sorry
yeah,
if that was a triggering word to use, but
I'm a little traumatized at the moment. I just felt the need to explain myself.
oh
I
no,
asked
I
you about.
just meant more like symbolically. Like sometimes I
Yeah,
feel like these situations, I should say,
it's
not
probably true.
tests,
No,
situations
you're right.
arise and we can
Situations,
have the opportunity to apply what
opportunity
we've
for growth.
learned. Let's
This is
reframe.
this is the active Erlina unraveling. Anyway, it's fine. It's fine. But no, I'm so curious. When people do not have a bunch of religious training, where did you start with your idea, your concept of a higher power, and where are you today?
Yeah. So for me, like I mentioned, I wasn't really sure how I felt about the word God in the 12 steps. And fortunately, early on, I had somebody say to me, nature can be your higher power.
Mm,
And I was like, okay, like I don't really get what you mean because it didn't really make sense, but oh my gosh, like nature, has been my access point to spirituality. And that is why I host retreats and I try to find these places in nature that are, really powerful for people in and of themselves, because I don't really think it's one of those things that you can really just say like, oh yeah, nature is your higher power. You have to feel it. And I'll never forget, like my journey has definitely been through my experiences in nature. I was trekking the Annapurna circuit in Nepal in my first year of sobriety, which is in the Himalayas. And it's one of those experiences that was so far outside what I ever thought I could do. I'm traveling with my best friend who has trained marathons and is super physically fit. And I have my regular yoga practice, but I'm not prepared to climb mountains in the Himalayas. But she's like, no, I've done lots of research. You'll be fine. And the amazing thing is, I was just using that mantra one step at a time, in my
Were you
head, because
fine? I'm like on the edge of
I
my seat. Were you okay?
I
I mean,
was
clearly you
fine.
survived.
And people, I mean, you'd be amazed how many different types of people I saw on that trail. It's an accessible hike. It's not like climbing Everest. It's
Oh,
hard, but it's accessible and you can really take it at your own pace. And there was a time when in the first few days, my knees were in excruciating pain. It was my one of my knees, and then I started overcompensating, and it became the other one. And I was like, that was a spiritual experience in the sense that I am walking, and I was like, one step at a time, like literally, because the pain on day like 4 or 5 got super bad, and I was just looking around. And I remember simultaneously, I'm surrounded by these mountains that I'm like, you realize how small and insignificant, like in a good way, I mean, as like
and
this
connected.
human. And, we talked earlier about how we become so absorbed in like our own reality and like needing to get a drink and like all the little stressors that would happen in my office cubicle. And I felt so held and supported, and just like that state of overwhelming awe that it really, I feel like it made me do something that I never could have done. And also just moving my body that way, like the once I got over the physical discomfort, it was like that high that I would get sometimes, and I still get it. Like I love going to waterfalls in Bali, and I'm like a child. Like I get like all giddy. And it's like this high that I'm experiencing is what I wanted so bad with like cocaine or
Right.
ecstasy. But when I was
Yes.
doing that, it was so short-lived. There were such heavy consequences of the come down. It was so unsustainable. And like that to me, like when I think of nature, there's so many aspects of nature that to me are like, it connects me to something bigger, because also there's that mystical element, and there's the magic of like, if you contemplate like a tiny seed turning into a giant tree, and this universal intelligence that is part of all of us, that there is, there's something deeply spiritual about that to me. So that's definitely been um, a huge part of my spiritual practice. And then of course, the teachings of yoga and really living that as a lifestyle has also been a huge part of my spiritual practice.
No, that's I mean, God shows up in nature for sure. And I just heard somebody, I don't know, I was probably listening to a podcast or something. They were talking about the that experience where you're out in nature and you see just something just phenomenal. Like really, I feel like awesome is a word that's totally overused, but really when you experience awe in
Yes.
nature, like I don't want to get too weird, but um, they were talking about how when you're in that place and you feel small and insignificant, yet connected to something bigger. It was like
Yes.
this weird paradox. And I was like, that is almost like being high, because when you're high, it's almost like you disappear, but you're in touch with this feeling of joy. And it's so interesting that those two, it's not lost on me that alcohol is called spirits.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like that is what we're seeking. And but so we just learn. We're not saying you have to give up feeling high. We're just saying, how about you forego the thing that's killing you and try something that will help you to thrive?
Yeah. I mean, we could talk so much about awe in itself, because there's like some really interesting scientific studies about how humans are impacted by experiences of awe. And also, in one of the translations of the Yoga Sutras by Matthew Remsky, he talks, one of the lines he translates as, that awe and wonderment, the experiences of awe and wonderment are the gateway to integration, which essentially is leading you towards this experience of interconnectedness and wholeness.
Gateway to
Integration. I need to,
integration.
I might be slightly off quoting that, but it's in Matthew Remsky's
I'm feeling it.
translation of the Yoga Sutras. And I love that. I mean, that to me just resonated so strongly. I remember when I read that, I was already living in these really natural places. And I just thought, I can completely understand that because, and that's why I say you have to feel it, because you can't
Yeah.
really like, I don't really think you can just think about these things to fully comprehend it. But it's like when you get that experience of being in a state of total awe and wonderment and you have goosebumps and you start to feel like
Yeah.
kind of like, or that sense that you're just part of something greater, it makes you feel like you're not just alone,
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
study that I mentioned, I forget what the researcher's name was, but there was a study where they had one group of people look up at city buildings for a given period of time, and they put another group of people looking at trees or something in nature. And immediately following that, they didn't know, but they were presented with a scenario where somebody like kind of fell and dropped a bunch of pens on the ground. And the people who were looking up at nature were significantly more generous when it came to getting down and helping that person, which it's like, I mean, just a few minutes
Yeah.
looking up at trees. And then you just think about the environments that we live in and
Ah,
how we could
yeah.
potentially be negatively impacted by our disconnection from nature.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. It does sort of give you pause and be like, how can I integrate more nature into my life? But it's so funny. You cannot, and the big book talks about having spiritual experiences, right? And some of the experiences, I've always had this terrible analogy. It's like an orgasm. You can't explain it to somebody, you have to experience it.
Exactly.
You know what I
Exactly.
mean? It's probably not the most useful, but everybody gets it.
Yeah. No, it's so
um,
true.
yeah. And so that kind of leads me back to the final question from the lightning round that I was going to ask you about the God shot stories or the spiritual experiences. It sounds like nature is the place where you have had those moments where you felt connected and like that you could transform.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's amazing. It's not even like there's one specific place. Like in the last few years, I discovered scuba diving.
I'm dying to
And
do that.
oh my gosh, for anyone, like I used to think of that as a really extreme sport and it is the most
Peaceful.
relaxing,
Yeah.
peaceful, like you're like an astronaut going to another planet. And I did that. It was after coming out. That was one of the first things I did after things started to loosen up because I
Mm.
live in a place where scuba diving is really close by. So, during the pandemic, just to be able to kind of shift my perspective and transport myself into this world. I mean, talk about awe and wonderment, like being surrounded by this whole life that is literally just beneath the surface, but it just really expands your perspective into something so much bigger. And you're totally disconnected from technology. Nobody can talk to you or ask you for things. You're just in your own world. And it's just, yeah.
Yeah.
So
If gazing at trees makes you more generous,
oh my
just
gosh.
gazing
Going
at all
like
the
15 meters underwater.
that's amazing. And there's that expanding word, expands your perspective.
Oh yeah.
We do get so narrow focused. Did you ever come across Andrew Huberman's podcast?
Yes. Yes, I love him.
I always giggle when I talk about Andrew Huberman. I love him. No, he does talk a lot about the circadian rhythms. Like a lot of people don't sleep well, especially early in sobriety when your brain is healing and things are getting back to homeostasis. And he talks about how um I think he calls it light viewing early in the morning, like starts to
Mm,
reset your circadian rhythms. But viewing horizontal viewing and relaxes you and does all these great things. And it's so interesting. He made the point that we're looking at our phones, which is a very short, narrow, like literally just feet from your face. And it's like this narrow gaze, and that increases our stress levels. But then when you look up and you're looking at the sky or trees or nature, it naturally starts to reset your mind and your emotions. And I feel like so much of sobriety is about emotion management.
Oh, 100%. And I think it's important to acknowledge too that you don't need to be like in the Himalayas or scuba diving in order to have
Right.
that
Go
connection with nature.
outside.
Yeah, like you said, like first thing in the morning, like expose yourself to natural light. Just go outside, look at the grass in your, well, maybe not look down, but like look at the sky above. But that's
Yeah.
a core principle of Ayurveda too, is just returning to these natural rhythms. And that's been a huge part of like with self-care and my own sobriety is having a sleep pattern that's more in tune with
Yeah.
waking up. I like to wake up just before the sun comes up, and
Me
I
too.
really guard my evenings. Like I like to go to bed early, and I just feel so much better when I'm more like in sync with this natural rhythm. Cause
Yeah,
like
for
when you're
sure.
staying out all night doing drugs and you've been out all night and then you see the sun come up, like that's a very different experience.
Yeah. Usually is filled with shame and regret.
Yeah.
um, I want to transition a little bit to, we were talking about like, I like it when people can walk away from the podcast and apply something. So obviously nature and the books, I think will be really helpful. But, and I know you're a coach and you help people. Do you work one-on-one with people, or do you do group, or both?
Both. Yeah.
But okay. So, what are some of the somatic practices that you help people with to, we talked about healing trauma and somatic healing because, and actually to bring up Andrew Huberman one more time, um, we often think of our brain as being in our cranial cavity, right? And he makes this analogy that, yes, that is true. However, the nervous tissue runs through your entire body, right? Down
Exactly.
to the every square inch of your skin. He said, if you took away the bones and muscle and organ, you'd be in, all you'd be left with a silhouette of the human body, the brain connected to all the, and I was like, wow, I never really thought of it that way. And it makes sense because I've been reading books like The Body Keeps the Score,
Yes.
or these really trippy science experiments where people respond viscerally. There was that, I don't know if you've heard this study about the guy who had his hemispheres detached because he was having terrible seizures, and they didn't know this back in the day, but it left him with terrible short-term memory. He had like a 30-second memory of something horrible. I don't remember how long, but the way it manifested or played out in his life, they did this experiment where they put him in a room, and then a doctor came in with a white lab coat, and he had like a pin in his hand. He went to shake his hand and he pricked this guy's hand, and he like jerked his hand back, and he was like, wow, that really hurt. And he was like, oh, I'm terribly sorry. Let me excuse myself from the room. I'll come back. So in the time that he left and came back, the guy forgot about him because his brain didn't work that way. He couldn't, wasn't able to transmit the memory into long-term memory. And so when the doctor comes back, he holds his hand out again, and the guy would not shake his hand. And he made up a story. He goes, I don't shake hands with people in white lab coats.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that trippy? His
Yeah.
body remembered.
Oh my
His body
gosh.
remembered, even though, and he made up a story. We were just talking about it.
Wow.
Yeah. So
That is incredible.
a couple of stories like that, but it's so amazing how your body keeps the score. And in AA and other programs, we do, look to our past and try to resolve it. But I think the missing piece, especially for trauma, is the body. So what types
Absolutely.
of so obviously meditation and yoga are really good practices. What other kinds of practices or tools do you use to help people work through their somatic uh trauma?
Well, yeah. So, like you said, yoga, I think doing very slow, mindful yoga practice has been key to starting to rebuild that relationship, because I love Nikki says the
Yeah.
issues are in our tissues, but it's
Yeah.
so true. I think sometimes we underestimate and really, yoga as a practice, like I experienced this myself. Things start to unravel in the midst of the practice that are being really stored
Mm,
in our physical body. Like we experience life through our body. So our life, our body is filled with these impressions that we accumulate. And so taking the time to rebuild that relationship through a daily yoga practice, because too, that takes time. And so, sometimes that's years. But one of the things that I like to do with people is start to work on body tracking. So just noticing how your physiology changes in different experiences. So to give you an example of the way that I personally used to just completely disconnect, like I used to live in that reality where, there's your brain in your head. And when you're doing like mind things, when you're doing brain related things, like when I'm sitting at my office, it's just a mental experience. But if you think about it, and if I think back to my cubicle days, I would get a notification and realize that I needed to be at a meeting and I wasn't prepared for the meeting I was going to need to be in. And all of a sudden, this reaction starts to occur in my body. It's like my breath becomes super shallow. I'm sweating. I become hyper focused and my whole physiology starts to change.
Your heart pounds. You sweat. I'm
Exactly.
familiar.
And I think anyone who's listening, I would imagine is familiar with that. And if we respected that for what it was, that we have, entered into this more dysregulated state in our nervous system, we would take the time to discharge all that energy. But because we don't assign the same value, because really the body is reacting in the same way as if the building was on fire. It's the same thing. You'd be surged with stress hormones. You become hyper alert. You'd be ready to go. You're sweating, your heartbeat increases, but we don't honor those experiences. Instead, we're like, oh, get on with it, or we choose things to numb out because we don't take the time to really like discharge all that energy that's been mobilized in our body just from something that happened in our mind.
Yeah.
So I really like to work with people on bringing back that level of awareness so you can kind of befriend your nervous system and really honor that for what it is. If you do have that experience in the middle of the workday, taking the time to do what you need to do. And, that might be just getting up and kind of like shaking out a little bit or doing a few stretches, taking time to do a breathing practice. And that's so much of that too that is how we get ourselves back in a place where we can be functioning at work. We trick ourselves into saying, I don't have time for that, or, it's not worthwhile. But if we are in this hyper stressed, hyper anxious place, we are not performing at our best and we're not showing up the best in our relationships with other people in that environment. So yeah, that practice of body tracking and really getting in touch with your body is another one that I find to be really important.
So it's so interesting you mentioned that scenario because I was like right there with you. I was like, oh my God, that has happened to me. But I'm going to hustle my ass to that meeting. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? So I wouldn't like, let me just take a moment to honor my feelings and just charge.
Right.
Maybe. But what I would have done is I would have after the meeting, I would have been like, I would vent my anger. I would say, let's go get a drink, or I need to eat something with sugar or something high in fat. You know what I'm saying? Like that's what I would have done. So I would have like powered through the meeting and come away feeling like crap about myself as a person. Like it's like we're
Yeah.
talking about that inner critic. And so in a real practical sense, you're saying that after that experience, you honor it by acknowledging it for what it is. People this sounds silly, but people underestimate how powerful shaking it out is.
Oh yeah. It's hugely powerful. And if
It's
you
like
have
the
doubts about
EFT.
that stuff, it's all well researched now.
It's all,
So
yeah. Have you tried EFT tapping?
yeah. So
It's really
a friend
cool.
who I worked with and lived with at a retreat center has really gotten very into that. So I've had her host tapping circles for my
Oh my God,
community.
so good.
Yeah. And and you made a really good point. So I wasn't saying like, okay, something has
Yeah,
come
no,
up,
no.
but
I
it's
didn't think
time
you
for
were.
self-care.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but if I think the key differences would be feeling super bad on yourself because that happened. And
Yeah.
then deciding to say, oh my God, like I need to sit here and work, like just turning into these really like compulsive behaviors of like overworking then to compensate and prove yourself, or picking up a bottle of wine after work and drinking the whole
Right.
thing to forget about it, or all
Yeah.
these other things
Because you need to
versus
relax. Yeah.
exactly versus having a conversation with someone about it, doing a practice, shaking it out, tapping, breathing exercises.
Did you ever
So
watch Grey's Anatomy?
I didn't really ever get into it, but I'm of course aware of the show.
The only reason I bring it up is because this image keeps coming to mind. So Meredith is the main character, and she has this friend, and something really stressful happens. Sometimes they would dance it out.
Yes. I was just going to say dancing,
Right.
dance meditation. I discovered that. That's so funny because that was a really big part of my early recovery. I did a dance meditation at this yoga and meditation retreat center in Cambodia.
Wow.
And I was in tears because I thought, I
Happy tears or
never, happy
crying?
tears. Like I was like,
Okay.
I never thought that I could I loved to dance when I would go out and party, but I
Yeah. Yeah.
associated that with drinking. And I thought
I know.
I had to leave that behind. And dance meditation is like so powerful. And even if you're not doing it in a guided setting, I say to people in my group, because I have an 8-week program that's happening now. And I really encourage people to find their form of movement. And that was one of the things that I said, turn on music alone
Yeah.
in your room and just
Yeah.
notice what it feels like to just dance for you.
Yeah.
Like, and if
Yeah.
you've never
Dance it
done that
out.
without substances involved, it is the best way to shift your energy.
It is so good. Yeah, I'm a She Recovers coach as well.
Oh,
And they
nice.
have and they have Peyton Kennedy host. I think it's Peyton that does the like a dance party, like an online dance party on Fridays.
So
It's
good.
so good. Yeah, just moving your body and free. And I was just so funny. I was just having a conversation with my older son. He's almost 22. Yeah, we were talking about drunk dancing, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm not going to do that." Because we were talking about going to Vegas, and he was like, "What else is there to do?" Because I was like, "Oh, we need to go to the restaurants and shop, and there's shows," and he doesn't want to go. And I don't even know why. I was like, "You could go dance," and he's like, "I don't do that." I was like, "Maybe you should." Anyway, that's a whole
It's a
thing.
whole
Okay, so
different thing.
it's a whole different thing. Can you tell me about your 8-week program?
Yeah. So I'm so excited. I just launched the first group. So it's 8 weeks long. And the way that it works is there's an online training portal. So every week there's a new module released that has like more educational type of training. And that gets into things like starting to deconstruct our beliefs about alcohol and look at what the conditioning is that shapes our relationship with alcohol. We focus on how alcohol impacts our physiology, things like how to break habits and build new ones, like on a more practical sense, creating healthy boundaries, communicating, like navigating social situations and communicating, that you're not drinking with confidence and feeling supported in that. Self-compassion and forgiveness is a big one.
Huge.
Teaching people to build their own daily meditation practice and breath work. So there's a whole component. I might have left some things out, but there's a whole online component that people can access sort of on demand. And then
Mhm.
there's live coaching calls. So once a week we get together and work through in a live setting. I always introduce the theme. There's always a meditation and people can ask questions. And another important part is there's exercises. So I have workbooks that correspond with each module so that people can integrate it, not just listen to the information. Because, like we've said throughout this conversation, these things are not just things you can like necessarily just receive, I think, or take in one way. So there's kind of journaling and exercises that people can do during the program too. So yeah, I
Love
love
that.
that. To me has been so great because I have been doing retreats for a number of years and it almost feels like replicating that sort of like community
Yeah,
experience online and, people are able to join from all over.
that is amazing. I love the online. Listen, I love me a worksheet. I love
Yes.
it's like just ask the questions. I'll come up with some answers, and it's just so interesting because it's amazing how questions are so powerful. The right questions at the right time with the right attitude can absolutely transform like the context and perspective that you're holding. It,
Yes.
it
I could
almost helps
not agree
you
more.
right? It helps you release the things that are not working for you any longer so that you can absorb new information that will change the trajectory of your life. And that's what we're doing, right? Change the trajectory of your life.
100%. And getting to
Yeah.
the, like, that first step of it, getting to the point where you're asking the questions,
Yeah.
where you're willing to ask the questions versus, again, it's like so often we have this voice that's so convincing that we think that it's just spitting the truth all day, and we never question
Lies.
it.
Lies.
Lies.
Lies, you tell me. Don't believe don't believe the first thing you think. Listen, I could obviously talk to you forever, and I realize you do have all day. It's just the morning there for you. I
No, I
was
know. I
so
love how
worried.
our lightning round has become the whole conversation,
That
but
was a
it's
long
nice to
conversation,
be able
but
to just have conversation naturally.
I know, but we did. I really feel like we got a good sense of your story. I mean, it's like it doesn't, the circumstances are always different, but the feelings are all the same. The feeling of hopelessness and like, this isn't me, this isn't how I was raised. And the crushing shame and guilt that we feel that is required before we're willing to surrender, right? And we think that surrender in our society has such a bad connotation or ideas around it, but there is power in surrender. There is power. And so that speaks to the idea that our thinking is 180 degrees away from the thinking of God, right? The thing that I thought, like, alcoholism is the best worst thing that ever happened to me. It's the
Mhm.
best because I was set on this path, and the consequences on the borders are so severe that if I go off that path, I could literally die. That's how I drank. I drank like a crazy ass woman. And so I thought having to give it up was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me because now I have, and listen, the path is wide. The path is a balance, and not a razor's edge. It's a path. So there's some grace there, but it's so interesting. Like, the exact opposite thing I thought would help me. Like, okay, so let me just give you an example of 180. So when I showed up to AA, they said, I'd be like, oh, I'm mad at this person, they do this and that and this and that. And they said, oh, pray for them. I'm like, you mean slash their tires, right? But no,
Yeah.
it was the exact opposite of what my instinct was telling me to do. And I have found that that has been the case over and over and over again in recovery. It's just been amazing.
I completely agree. I remember hearing people, kind of proclaim like, I'm a grateful alcoholic. And when I first got in, I was like, oh, that is like, they're just telling
Such
themselves,
bullshit.
yeah, like, I'm like, come on, like, let's just all get real. We all know we're like in absolute misery here.
Yeah, this sucks.
I'm like, I've had to leave school, or the second time around, it's like, so, but I totally get it now because, and the amazing thing is, there's so much wisdom in the steps that anyone could benefit from, and not only that one recovery path, but any recovery path, because we're
Any.
all kind of recovering in various ways from
Mhm.
something. And so I think that, yeah, it really is a gift. Like anyone, I think when we're presented with these challenges that require us to really pause and look inward and, call on and start to build a set of tools that will help us, it's only going to improve our life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tell me, Mary, how can people contact you if they're interested in learning more about your coaching or your 8-week program?
So my website for is sunandmoonsoberliving.com, and the Instagram handle is at sunandmoon.soberliving. And both of those, you can subscribe to the email list, you can follow along. I put out a lot of resources on there. And I also have a podcast, the Sun and Moon Sober Living podcast.
Yay. Oh, were you going to invite me to be a guest?
Yes, I was. That's exactly what I was going to say when we got off. I was like, we obviously could just go on. And I'm like,
Just
this
kidding.
is to be continued. No,
Oh my God, that's
absolutely. I
so funny.
feel
Just
like we
see,
could
see
do
what
a
I did there? I
series.
just totally invited myself onto your podcast. Shameless. I think maybe that's maybe a downside of sobriety. Become shameless. Maybe
No,
there is an
it's
appropriate place for
beneficial.
shame.
I think it's beneficial, Like it really, I really think it is. I feel that way
Yeah.
too. Cause I was like, same with you. I mean, approaching you to come on, but it's like to be able to, I don't know. I really benefited so much from people's stories. So I think it's important
Oh,
for
me
people to hear
too.
these
Yeah,
conversations.
hugely. Yeah, I heard that an acronym for HOPE is hearing other people's experience.
Yeah. I
That's a
love
good
that.
one. Huh? I love that. Well, Mary, thank you so much. I could talk to you. We didn't even get to the Joe Dispenza stuff. Gosh, we will have to do that
To be
on round two.
continued.
To be
Yeah. We'll
continued.
do it on mine.
So much to talk about. Thank you so much for this time. I can't wait for our next conversation. And I really, really, really enjoyed our conversation today.
I did too. Thank you so much.
We'll talk soon.